Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
The High Court has ruled that the government acted unlawfully when it did not reveal details of some of the COVID contracts it had signed while procuring personal protective equipment within the required timeframe. The court said the Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, had acted unlawfully and he had breached his legal obligation. The Department for Health and Social Care said it had been forced to sign deals within very short timescales and against a background of unparalleled global demand.
However, the political row over the government's handling of the crisis has continued. Today, the High Court ruled that Health Secretary Matt Hancock acted unlawfully when he failed to publish details of contracts signed during the pandemic. Our political correspondent Liz Bates is in Westminster. Liz.
Yes, so a damning ruling for the Health Secretary. Billions has been spent over the past year, and today the High Court said that in not publishing some of the details of that spending, he has acted unlawfully. Now, of course, this all goes back to the beginning of the pandemic when the government decided to suspend its normal tendering process. That was so that it could act quickly on things like PPE and test and trace, but it has led to allegations of lucrative contracts being handed to friends and acquaintances and a general lack of transparency around the process. Now, the government has always denied those allegations, but it was that lack of transparency that the court has ruled on today. And the man behind that legal challenge, Marr, reacted to the ruling earlier.
Of course, we all appreciate that these were exceptional times, but we know that government just didn't really take it seriously. It doesn't care, it either doesn't care about transparency or it doesn't want us to have transparency. And neither of those is good enough.
Now, the Department of Health has said in a statement that it has been working tirelessly throughout the pandemic, that sometimes contracts needed to be awarded at speed and that it will continue to publish information as quickly as possible. Important to remember, though, that this is just the first ruling on this issue. There are more to come, and some of them involve Dominic Cummings, the Prime Minister's former aide. So we're very much at the beginning of this legal battle.
Now, you've been found to have acted unlawfully this week by refusing to publish details of COVID-19 contracts. Will you resign?
No, that's not quite right. It's important to be clear on what this court case did and didn't find. The court case did not find that there was a problem with any of the contracts. What it found is that whereas we're supposed to publish the details of contracts within 30 days of them being signed, on average, we published them in the heat of the crisis, on average 47 days after they were signed.
Sorry to come in, because I am careful to be specific. I know that they're not talking about the details of the contracts. That's why I said refusing to publish the details. The High Court judge said there is now no dispute that in a substantial number of cases, the Secretary of State breached his legal obligation to publish contract award notices within 30 days of the awards of contracts. I mean, look, people understand you have to spend money, you have to act quickly in a pandemic. This is about transparency. That matters as well, doesn't it?
That's right. So that's right. The question that you first asked was about a refusal to publish. That's not true. We published the details of all these contracts that we had to publish, absolutely and quite rightly. On average, we published them just over a fortnight later than they should have been. And there's a reason for that, Sophie. The reason is that there was a global shortage of PPE. We needed to buy PPE to save lives. And my officials, with my full support, spent every waking hour buying PPE so that even though we came close, we never actually ran out of PPE in this country. And they did that even though the paperwork got delayed by, on average, just over a fortnight. That's what the court found. And I think any Secretary of State in my position would absolutely back my officials in doing the right thing, saving lives.
So will you now commit to publishing the names of all firms who were given public contracts and how much they were paid?
Well, of course we publish all the details we're required to publish. And that's been happening all the way through. The fact is that in the heat of the first wave, on average, we were just over a fortnight late in some of these publications. That's what the court case found. That was put right over the summer.
So you will commit to publishing the names and details, the question was?
I'll commit to publishing what is, on the standard basis, what is legally required and what is normal to publish. And we do that. And we have done since the summer. So, you know, the actual substance of this is how quickly did we act to buy the PPE and other things that were needed to save lives when there was a global scramble? And the answer is we acted incredibly quickly. Some of the paperwork got a little bit delayed, and I'm absolutely backing my team, who did a phenomenal job in incredibly difficult circumstances. And we follow all these rules. We follow them absolutely. The transparency is important. I agree with that. And in fact, in past jobs, I've been responsible for putting some of these rules in place. And I'm perfectly happy with how the team, in fact, I think it's quite important to state on the record, I'm incredibly grateful for what the team did because the circumstances were so difficult.
OK, a really simple question for you. Matt Hancock has been found to have acted unlawfully over not publishing these COVID contracts. Should he resign?
I don't want to call for him to resign. I do think he's wrong about the contracts. There's been a lot of problems with the contracts on transparency, on who the contracts have gone to, and there's been a lot of wasted money. And I think that is a real cause for concern. But at the moment, at this stage of the pandemic, I want all government ministers working really hard to get us through this because, you know, whatever political differences, what the public know is this needs to succeed. The vaccine rolled out needs to succeed. And I think in those circumstances, what I'd say to Matt Hancock is you need to, go further on the vaccine, go faster on the vaccine. You need to have a roadmap on Monday from the Prime Minister. But I think at this stage, calling for people to resign is not what the public really want to see.
Can I turn to one of the other big issues this week? You'll have seen that Matt Hancock, the Health Secretary, was found to have acted unlawfully in terms of when he released details of contracts that had been signed off by his department at an early stage in the pandemic. It was a very, very stressful period for the government and the Health Secretary and the Health Department. I do understand all of that. What do you think should happen now? What should be the next move on this?
Well, he should publish the contracts because the court has found it unlawful. He should cancel the scheme, the temporary scheme that he's been using without any accountability or any transparency. He should come to Parliament on Monday and explain what he's going to do. It is outrageous, frankly. If this is the sort of behaviour, giving contracts to your pub landlord and your best mate, that you would expect in a banana republic, not indeed in our own country.
Now, I'm looking forward with great enthusiasm to talking to the Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, but he's not available quite yet, so I'm joined by Joe Coburn, who's come back again very kindly. Joe, we're going to be talking with Matt Hancock about this Good Law Project case in the High Court, which he has lost and has indeed acted unlawfully. It's a very, very complicated case, so maybe we can explain to viewers exactly what it's about.
Right. Well, I mean, some of the contracts, if you remember, at the beginning of the pandemic, contracts that were signed particularly for things like PPE, that personal protective equipment.
The visors and the rest.
Absolutely. Yeah. And as you remember, of course, there was a shortage. And to some extent, the government would say, look, we were at the start of a pandemic and the pressure was on. And we were, to some extent, scrabbling around looking for contracts. But they did need to follow due process. And what they have been found and publish them and actually follow due diligence in terms of those contracts. I believe you must have the Health Secretary.
He's just arrived. He won't have been able to hear that, but the Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, joins me now. Matt Hancock, we were just discussing the High Court case that you have lost. You have broken the law. Can I ask you about that? The High Court has ruled that you acted unlawfully by not publishing contracts quickly enough that your department struck during the coronavirus pandemic. And these are contracts that were worth millions and millions of pounds, sometimes hundreds of millions of pounds. Would you like to take this opportunity to apologise to people for that?
Well, thanks, Andrew. And I could hear the discussion that you've just had. And as was set out, it's really clear what this court case is and isn't about. The court case did not find that there was a problem with any of the contracts. What it found is that whilst, of course, contracts like this need to be published, and we've published all of the details that are required, you're supposed to do that within 30 days. And on average, in the height of the pandemic, we did that within 47 days. So we were just over a fortnight late on average with this publication. And the reason for that is because my team were working 7 days a week, often 18 hours a day, to get hold of the equipment that was saving lives.
I understand that, but as you know, I'm sorry, Andrew, Matt Hancock, as you know, some of those contracts were nonetheless highly controversial. And the judge himself, Lord Justice Chamberlain, says that you spent, and I quote, vast quantities of public money on pandemic-related procurements. The public were entitled to see who this money was going to, what it was being spent on, and how the relevant contracts were awarded. And he's absolutely right, isn't he?
He's 100% right. And that is absolutely possible. The technical issue is that we were just over a fortnight late on average with the publication of these things. And the reason for that is a reason that I back my team up 100% on.
OK, so
they were totally focused on saving lives. If you think, just remember back, Andrew,
I know the situation was stressful.
And the situation was that we were very, very tight on PPE. And thankfully, thanks to the incredible work of my team, we didn't have a national shortage of PPE.
All right.
And that's because they spent all of their time buying life-saving equipment,
some of these
paperwork was a little bit late.
Listen, we both know that some of these contracts were controversial at the time and subsequently. My question is, if you think that the judge was right, if you think this is really just a technical issue, why did you spend £200,000 of public money fighting the case in the first place? Wasting that money.
I don't think that there's been any of that. We do have to.
Well, the money's been wasted.
Well, if you ask why people have raised a case like this on this matter, perfectly reasonable question to ask. But of course, the government has to defend its position, because what we did was we did what was right, which was to buy life-saving equipment as fast as we possibly could. And then, of course, to make required publications. If you remember,
I do remember back. But the question, I'm sorry. The question is, was it the right PPE? Were these the right companies? Did they provide value for money? And was their equipment good enough? And there've been questions about all of that. The National Audit Office, whose report preceded all of this, have said that there was a special, as it were, fast-track lane for people who had contacts with politics and government, and that such organisations were 10 times likelier to get the contract. And that has led many people to think there is something wrong here, something fundamentally wrong going on in the way these contracts were awarded.
No, as you say, and as you said in your response to your earlier interviewer, who was making all sorts of false allegations, the National Audit Office found that all of these contracts were awarded in an appropriate way. Of course, we fast-tracked the leads that we thought were most likely to be able to get hold of the stuff fastest, and they did that, as you just read out, 10 times faster.
Let me read you out something else from the National Audit Office report, because this is quoting directly from them. And they said that your actions, and I quote, diminished public transparency and the lack of adequate documentation means we cannot give assurance that the government has adequately mitigated the increased risks arising from emergency procurement or applied appropriate commercial practices in all cases. That's the National Audit Office basically saying you did not give them the information that allowed them to take the judgments you've been talking about.
Andrew, as the National Audit Office said in the quote you just read out, this was an emergency situation. My team worked so hard and they were successful in ensuring that there was never a national shortage of PPE. I back them every step of the way, and any Secretary of State would, and the whole nation should be, and I think actually in very large part is incredibly grateful for the work they've done, because we've saved lives. Now, of course, there's the loose ends that need tying up. But what is most important in the middle of a pandemic is you do everything you can to save lives. Like, for instance, the subject that we're talking about today, which is the absolutely superb vaccine rollout and the ability now to be able to set more advanced targets, again, because my team have worked so hard and done so well, no matter what the naysayers say.
So you have nothing to apologise for at all, despite losing a case and being legally in breach of the law?
Look, people can make up their own view about whether I should have told my team to stop buying PPE and spend the time bringing forward those transparency returns by just over a fortnight, or whether I was right to buy the PPE and get it to the front line. You tell me that that's wrong. You can't. And the reason you can't is because it was the right thing to do.
Well,
and all legal cases about timings of transparency returns are completely second order compared to saving lives. And there is no health secretary in history who would have taken the view that they needed to take people off the project of buying PPE in order to ensure that 9 months later, the health secretary didn't have a slightly bumpy interview on the Marr programme. It's not what it's about, Andrew. It's about doing the right thing.
Bumpy interviews on the Marr programme are always what it's about.
CJ, it's got nothing to apologise for. In fact, actually, this was an act of heroism by our health secretary.
Well, we do think it's pretty remarkable. We wonder whether there has ever been another minister who has been found by the High Court to have broken the law and has responded by saying, I did nothing wrong. We are going to write to the High Court, drawing this to its attention. We do not think it is the right way for a minister to respond to a High Court finding that he's broken the law. I mean, a lot of that stuff is quite disingenuous as well, because the notion that the dude in the civil service who was valiantly trying to get anyone to support his attempts to comply with the law requiring transparency within 30 days, the notion that that guy, if he wasn't producing the contract award notices, would instead have been buying PPE is just, it's just nonsense. It's not supported by any truth. The notion that these were technical breaches somehow, I mean, Hancock focuses elsewhere on the fact that certainly by the end of the proceedings, they were 17 days late on average. But the contracts that were politically sensitive were held back for months and months and months. So the panic buying sort of ended in May. And in February, earlier this month, they were still publishing highly politically sensitive PPE contracts many, many, many months later. So, for example, they published another contract awarded to this jeweler based in Florida, Michael Sager, who did this deal with this odd Spanish businessman called Mr. Anderson. Mr. Anderson was to be paid more than $50 million by Mr. Sager, not for supplying PPE, but just for sort of acting as a go-between or an intermediary. All of the contracts that were politically sensitive, all or at least most of them, were held back for many, many months. And the High Court saw evidence that Number 10 asked for those contracts to be delayed, publication of those contracts to be delayed until it was more convenient for Number 10 to handle the comms in relation to them. So, you know, behind that rather blithe assertion that he did nothing wrong in breaking the law is a wealth of rather damning factual detail, it seems to me.
So what would you say when people say this is a victory, but a technical victory? What would you say to that?
Well, that point was put to the barrister acting for Matt Hancock in the High Court by the judge. The judge said, what does the word technical add? And Philip Moser QC, the very nice public law barrister that Matt Hancock railroaded into conducting this ill-fated defense, was forced to confess that the word technical added nothing. And the judge really did not like it. I mean, we all hate it, right? Try asking a traffic officer who pulls you over for speeding to let you off because your offence was just technical. What it really signals is that this government thinks that the law is something that applies to other people. We got that when Brandon Lewis talked about a specific and a limited breach of law. We got that when Boris Johnson refused to send the letter mandated by the Benn Act requesting an extension. He said he'd rather die in a ditch. We also got that when he did nothing after Dominic Cummings' appalling visit to Barnard Castle. What Hancock's description of his law-breaking as technical reveals is that this government thinks that the law is something that applies to other people, but not to them. And I think that's completely unacceptable.
Now, this is the argument being put, or is often put, that, well, in an ideal world, transparency would be a wonderful thing. But what matters in the worst national emergency since World War II is getting the job done, making sure people are protected. And therefore, the end justifies the means. What do you say to that?
Well, it's not an either or, right? They can perfectly well meet their transparency obligations whilst also procuring sufficient PPE. The civil servants in the real world who are buying PPE are different civil servants to the civil servants who are charged with publication of contract award notices. And this point too was addressed by the judge in his judgment. He said the problem with ignoring transparency obligations is that members of the public ask themselves the question, well, if government won't publish, and there is still a lot that government has yet to publish, why will they not publish it? What have they got to hide? And the judge says, you might end up reaching the conclusion that there is a very bad reason why government won't be transparent. And the bad reason is that inherent in parts of this procurement process is basic corruption. And speaking for myself, I have no doubt that there are cases of corruption, out and out corruption, amongst the £12.5 billion that government has spent on PPE. I'm a lawyer, I'm a QC, I know what corruption means. It's not a word I use lightly. I think there is corruption in this process. I hope to be able to put the documents in the public domain that will show that. In the meantime, all I can say is that I've seen an awful lot of very suspicious fact patterns, all of which bear the same features. And I think that the government's continued disinclination to come clean about the companies that went through its velvet-roped VIP lane, come clean about who went through, which ministers put them in the VIP lane, because the National Audit Office report identifies that the majority of people who went through the VIP lane were put in by ministers. What contracts, what successful contracts were won by those in the VIP lane, and what prices were paid to those successful VIP lane bidders. The government's refusal to come clean about any of that stuff, I think, is deeply, deeply troubling. It's not just troubling to me. The head of the National Audit Office, the sort of government spending watchdog, was asked by the Financial Times, can you rule out corruption in the procurement process? And Gareth Davies, from memory, I think is his name, said there are very serious weaknesses in the processes that government has adopted, and I can't rule out corruption. It's striking stuff.
I mean, it's also, I have to say, in terms of this idea that they've, every sinew has been stretched to get PPE. I mean, it was reported by last September that the number of NHS staff dying in the health service was double that of the previous 10 years. And many of those didn't have access to PPE. I mean, there was this other case, which you looked at earlier this year. I mean, well, we saw, for example, from Turkey, when this hoo-ha about this PPE that was coming from Turkey, turned out to be unusable. I mean, actually, along the way, the whole procurement in PPE was an absolute travesty, wasn't it?
Well, it's been quite extraordinary. So the NAO has released 2 reports, and in its second report, it identified that we had spent £12.5 billion on PPE, and that PPE we had bought at about 500% of the price that we were paying in the fourth quarter of 2019, i.e. in the last full quarter before the pandemic. So we were paying 5 times the price, and we bought 5 years of supply at 5 times the price. So I think there are some very serious questions to be asked about how that happened as well. Why did we buy so much at these all-time high prices? I mean, we know that some of it is sitting in fields in Suffolk, is in boats coming from China, is stored in China. Indeed, the NAO said the other day that government has bought so much of it that it is now having to appoint investigators to find it all. It's bought so much it doesn't know where it is. And it's not just the staggering quantity at the staggering prices either. Substantially every case we have looked at involving individual suppliers where we've been able to get proper transparency over what was actually supplied from these sometimes very odd counterparties has revealed that the PPE supplied by those counterparties was duff. So Ianda, we know that Ianda supplied £155 million of unusable face masks. We know that Pestfix supplied, I think it's between 50 and 60 million pounds of unusable face masks. We know that Sega, the company owned by this Florida jeweler, supplied 70 million pounds worth of sterile surgical gowns that can't be used as sterile surgical gowns because they're not wrapped in such a way as preserve their sterility. We know that there is something odd, although we can't yet get government to tell us what, about the gowns that were supplied by this Northern Irish confectioner, Clandboy Agencies. Government says of them, not that they are being used as gowns, but that they are available for use as part of the PPE suite or something like that. And, you know, every lawyer knows that when you see a formulation like that, it is hiding something. And the thing that is hiding is not a thing that is nice for the hider. So however you look at it, price, quantity, quality, the whole thing is a real disaster.
Now, this government's into many things: right-wing populism, nativism, demagoguery. The one thing they're not really into is the rule of law. So I suppose my question to you is, aren't they just going to shrug this off? Or do you think there will be a lasting impact on other procurement cases?
So Good Law Project has got maybe 10 procurement cases. This is the first. On Monday just gone, we also brought a challenge, which challenge was heard, to Dominic Cummings' decision to award a consultancy contract to his friends, his description, not mine, at Public First. And he did that under the auspices of Michael Gove. So we're waiting to hear about that case. We've got all of these other cases as well, some of which I've already mentioned. And what the High Court says in the decision out on Friday gone is that we, the Good Law Project, are a good, responsible and expert actor in this space. And it says too that we have standing. In other words, we have a sufficient interest to bring that challenge, and that's going to help us bring other challenges too. Now, transparency really, really matters, I think. And I'm very pleased that the High Court agreed with us. But it's not, at least I had thought, the most interesting of all of the cases that we're bringing. And so I have been really surprised by the level of public interest. So both Andrew Marr, we've already seen him, and Sophy Ridge really went for Matt Hancock in their interviews. Sophy Ridge asked Hancock whether he would resign. And, you know, it's been, as you said in your introduction, trending on social media all day. Indeed, it's been trending since Friday. And I think what that really signals is that this notion that this government is in it for itself and its friends, that it's spending public money improperly to reward those who are connected to it, its friends, donors, business associates, is a message that really resonates with people. I mean, that's been Good Law Project's experience as well, because we've not just had enthusiastic coverage in the usual places. The Sun, the Mail have both run complimentary pieces, as has the Times and the Telegraph. This stuff is resonating right across the spectrum, and it's resonating because people believe that bad things are happening, and they care about the misuse of their tax bills to as they fear, enrich friends of the Conservative Party. And they're right to fear it, because you know, the New York Times has pointed out that some vast sum of money has gone to associates of the Conservative Party.
This is a political question, I suppose, more than legal, but I'm interested in your thoughts. In the Clement Attlee's post-war Labour government, the Chancellor of the Exchequer resigned after he accidentally revealed a couple of lines from his budget speech to a journalist a few minutes before he gave that speech. And I'm not getting roasted about the past, because, like, you know, lots of terrible things happened. I'm not saying there was some perfect political system in the 1940s, but it was striking. The threshold for resignation was quite low for that Chancellor of the Exchequer. What does it tell us that a cabinet minister can be found by a High Court judge to be acted unlawfully and just brazen it out on television and not even consider resigning? It's not even crossed his mind.
Well, not only has he not resigned, but I understood him to say to Andrew Marr that he didn't think he'd done anything wrong. And that's quite a striking response to the finding of a High Court judge that you've broken the law. I mean, I think that really is flying a flag for the proposition that the law is not something that you as a minister need to be concerned by. I mean, this troubles me really, because it's inimical to my conception of what it is to be a public servant. You know, we should be wanting our ministers to hold themselves to a very high standard. We should be wanting them to be thoughtful about what they do, to be thoughtful about the criticism they receive, certainly to be thoughtful about findings of High Court judges that they have broken the law. But we get none of that. You know, instead we get complete disinterest in the face of extraordinary photos like that in The Guardian this afternoon. There's Matt Hancock leaning into his publican friend, to whom we learned later he awarded contracts for the delivery of vials, glass vials, for use in vaccines worth tens and tens of millions of pounds. Something odd is happening. They no longer seem to care. That's both bad for public administration, it's bad for the health of the country, and it's a troubling sign, really, about how effective the opposition is. Because one of the ways in which a government is kept honest is by an opposition that is snapping at its heels in the opinion polls and holding it to account, not just at the ballot box, but punishing it for its mistakes. And I would be worried, I think, if I was the Labour Party, to see that level of disinterest on the part of a high-profile government minister to a finding by the High Court that he had broken the law. I don't think that sends a signal to the Labour Party that the Labour Party is doing a good enough job.
And indeed, a question that's just come through from Kyle Balderson. The story is very quickly becoming why Starmer hasn't called for his resignation, showing how inadequate he is, he says. He should be taking scalps over this. I'll put that to Peter as well, I have to say, when he joins us, Peter Gagan from Open Democracy. But I'm interested in that, and quickly, as well as that, because you've got, the government's not going to defeat itself, Julian. So let you go on your way shortly. But are you also worried a bit? I mean, if you've got any thoughts on that, but I'll ask Peter as well. But also a clamp down. I mean, do you think with judicial review, they're going to come for that? They don't like these defeats. They don't like you turning them over like this. That, to avoid the humiliation, they'll just change the rules.
I think that would be a bridge too far for them. I think there are sort of two difficulties that they have. One is that the acts of union between England and Scotland preserve the Scottish legal system as an independent legal system. And if they close down judicial review in England, we could very easily move up to Scotland, and the United Kingdom government is domiciled, to use the sort of technical legal expression, throughout the whole of the UK. So it could be sued in Scotland as easily as it could be sued in England, and they can't close down the system in Scotland without breaking the acts of union at a time when it would be particularly politically provocative to rewrite that ancient treaty. The other thing is, I think what we're learning from the extent to which these procurement stories are resonating across the political spectrum is that the population of England, like the population of the entire United Kingdom, has a really firm attachment to ideas of what is right and what is fair. And although the government would much rather have this fight about judicial review on territory where they think they would win, so for example, Priti Patel is always attacking lefty lawyers in the sphere of asylum seekers, they worry about what those using judicial review to clamp down on perceptions of public corruption would say if that ability to deliver the accountability of ministers were shut down. I do think they would see, or at least see the risk of civil unrest if there was to be any real clampdown on judicial review.
And just finally, I mean, the expansion of the use of private contractors within the public domain has massively expanded, not just under Conservative governments, but also under Labour as well. I mean, do you think, I mean, the National Audit Office each year looks at the proportion of government budget going to private contractors. It's vast. And we know repeated scandals, whether it be the tagging of prisoners by, and it turned out some prisoners were dead and they still got paid for them. We all remember, of course, the Olympics, private contractors hired to do that. They didn't do their job. The army had to be taken in. I mean, there's lots of examples, high profile examples, but what does this raise these broader questions? Do you think they'll be answered?
Well, last weekend we wrote a letter to government about a £145 million contract awarded to Deloitte. And we think that over the course of the pandemic, something like £1.3 billion has been awarded to consultancy firms alone by this government. And we think that one of the reasons why so much has been spent is that the civil service is so hollowed out that it can't do any of these things itself. Indeed, my own suspicion is that the civil service is so hollowed out that they're not even able properly to manage their relationships with contractors. Anybody who uses outsourced consulting firms to help with bits of work will know that managing those relationships so you get value for money from those people so that you get what you want, particularly in an environment that is fast changing, as was the case during the pandemic, indeed is the case during the pandemic, requires an awful lot of manpower. You can't bring them in to do the work that you should be doing. You can only really bring them in to do discrete bits of add-on. And I think our public sector is now so small that we can't even efficiently use consultants, so we're spending far more than we should.